towards. You say, as they say in a television studio, going live now.
Yes, sir.
नहीं अभी भी तो 554 ही हुआ है.
Yes, sir. So we are live on YouTube, and we will take another 4-5 minutes to begin, sir. Since it's Jefford live on YouTube, yes.
इनका अभी 555 ही हुआ है.
Yes, sir. 555 हुआ है. I'm just saying हम लोग YouTube पे जा चुके हैं और screen just has the plate, the graphic plate.
इनका ऑडियंस को भी पता चलेगा कि कितने लोग ज्वाइन किए हुए हैं?
नहीं sir. So they can hear us. Audience have started joining in. In 2 minutes, we will begin the webinar, sir. So 200 people have already joined, and there are more joining in.
Still, we have 3 minutes, Priyanka.
Yes, sir.
Won't start before
6. So it is 6 o'clock, sir, with your permission.
Sure.
Yes, Professor Sharma.
Yes, start.
So good evening, everyone, and warm greetings to all. Welcome to the second lecture under the ISLE-IHD webinar series, which is COVID-19 and its implications for economy, work, and livelihoods. I am Priyanka Tyagi, Senior Manager with Institute for Human Development. I look after Program Administration and Communication. IHD has been established under the aegis of Indian Society of Labor Economics and also hosts the ISLE Secretariat. The Institute for Human Development and the Indian Society of Labor Economics is indeed very grateful and thankful to Professor Nayyar, the president of the society, to have agreed to deliver this very important lecture titled Lives and Livelihoods in Pandemic Times. Before I hand over the reins of this webinar to the moderator of this session, Professor Alak Sharma, I would just like to say thank you again, Professor Nayyar. It is indeed a great honor to share screen space with you. You've been the Vice Chancellor of my alma mater, the Delhi University, so I'm extremely honored to be sharing the screen with you. And before I go ahead and introduce the moderator, I would just like to say thank you to all the participants. We've had an overwhelming response. Close to 1,200 registrations have taken place for this webinar. And as we mentioned in our invitation, we will be able to accommodate 500 to 600 people only. We are going live on IHD channel, the YouTube channel, which is IHD India. It will be available after the webinar as well. Please do visit our YouTube channel as well. The webinar is being moderated by Professor Alak Sharma. He's the director of the Institute for Human Development. He is also the conference president of Indian Society of Labor Economics and is the editor of the society's journal, the Indian Journal of Labor Economics, which is co-published with Springer. He's a well-known development and labor economist and has worked extensively on employment issues. I request Professor Alak Sharma to formally introduce Professor Deepak Nayyar, the series, and to moderate the session. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Priyanka. Friends, warm welcome to you, all of you, for being able to participate and attend this lecture, being delivered by Professor Deepak Nayyar on the topic Lives and Livelihoods in Pandemic Times. This is the most important question which is being confronted by all citizens in the country, whether to protect. Earlier, the Prime Minister had said that jaan hai to jahan hai. It was thought that we have to protect lives. But subsequently, there has been extensive loss of livelihoods. And now the question is also being asked, we have to protect lives as well as livelihoods. It is not either or choice, but both. I'm very happy that on this important topic, Professor Deepak Nayyar is speaking, giving this lecture. There can't be any better person than who is a very well-known development economist with a global reputation. This audience, he hardly needs any introduction, but just to give a very brief introduction to him. He is currently Professor Emeritus, Jawaharlal Nehru University. He is also President of the Indian Society of Labor Economics. He has held several positions in his long career. He has been Distinguished Professor of Economics at the New School for Social Research, New York. He has taught in the University of Oxford, University of Sussex, and IIM Calcutta. He has also served as Vice Chancellor of Delhi University, and as well as he has been Chief Economic Advisor to the Government of India in early 90s. His latest book, Resurgent Asia, Diversity in Development and Asian Transformation, is very well known, and he's received a wide publicity acclamation throughout the world. I won't take much of your time. I won't come in between audience and Professor Nayyar. So with these words, I would invite Professor Nayyar to start his talk. Thank you.
Before Professor Nair begins, I'll just take a second. I would request all the participants to please place their questions only in the Q&A tab, and questions, please, only questions. The chat window is not on today. Thank you very much. Professor Nair, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Priyanka, and thank you, Professor Sharma. I hope you can all hear me clearly. The object of my lecture is to analyze the implications and consequences of the ongoing pandemic for lives, livelihoods, and the economy in India. Its focus is on three propositions. First, I will show that the morbidity and mortality associated with COVID-19 in India is much lower than elsewhere in the world, to explore possible underlying reasons. Second, I will argue that saving lives and preserving livelihoods are imperatives, since both taken together shape the well-being of people, and it is for the government to reconcile these objectives instead of letting them be posed as an either-or choice, creating a false dilemma. Third, I will discuss how the prolonged and draconian lockdown in India has dealt a crippling blow to the economy, making recovery a far more difficult task, while placing a disproportionate burden on the poor, for whom it is now a question of survival. In conclusion, I will reflect briefly on possible ways forward. The oldest and largest democracies in the world, the United States and India, are often compared for striking differences and unexpected similarities. This time around, however, the difference that has surfaced would have been thought of as imagination running wild, even 4 months ago. The first person tested positive for COVID-19 on 21st January 2020 in the United States and on 30th January 2020 in India. More than 3 months later, on 8th May, the total number of infections was 1.32 million in the US and 59,700 in India, accounting for 33% and 1.5% respectively of the world total, while the number of COVID-19 deaths was 78,600 in the US and just about 2,000 in India, making up 28.5% and 0.7% respectively of the world total. The share of the two countries in world population, by contrast, is 4% and 18% respectively. Before the pandemic, it would have been impossible to predict, let alone imagine such a reality. Income per capita in India is a mere 3.2% of that in the US dollars 2010 as compared with US dollars 62,800. About 1/4 of the world's poor live in India, so that absolute poverty is high and nutrition levels are low. Population density in India is amongst the highest in the world. The poor, who live cheek by jowl in urban slums and cramped spaces in rural India, are most susceptible to a virus that is contagious. Public health systems and facilities are perhaps amongst the worst anywhere. The United States is a world apart. Now, to set the stage for my lecture before the play begins, I would like to situate it in the wider international context. May I have the first slide, please, Priyanka? The contrast stretches beyond the United States. On 7th May 2020, the cumulative total of COVID-19 deaths per million population in India, you would see, was just 1.3, as compared with 553 in Spain, 491 in Italy, 452 in the United Kingdom, 385 in France, 224 in the US, and 88 in Germany. The corresponding figures were 6 in South Korea, 4.5 in Japan, 3.3 in both China and Indonesia, 1.2 in Bangladesh, 0.8 in Thailand, and 0.4 in Sri Lanka. So you can see how unequal the mortality has been across space in the world. Can we move to the second slide, please, Priyanka? The asymmetry is even more striking if we consider the worldwide distribution of COVID-19 infections and COVID-19 deaths across countries, situated in the context of the respective shares of these continents in world population. Now you can see the share of infections in blue, the share in deaths in orange, and the share in world population in gray. On 8th May 2020, in the cumulative totals, you would see that Europe and North America taken together accounted for 75% of infections and 86% of deaths in the world, although their share in world population was only 14%. In sharp contrast, Asia accounted for 15.8% of the infections and 7.8% of deaths, while its share in world population was almost 60%. Africa accounted for only 1.5% of infections and 0.8% of deaths, though 17% of the world population lived there. Compared with North America and Western Europe, or their own population size, the number of infections and deaths in India, as well as in Asia and Africa, is far, far lower. The outcome then is puzzling, if not paradoxical. Indeed, there is an irony here. Of the worldwide COVID-19 deaths, almost 90%, if we include the middle-income countries in Southern America, are in rich industrialized countries, whereas just over 10% are in poor developing countries that are the proverbial home of disease and death. Of course, it is plausible to argue that unlike the rich countries, India is in the early stages where community transmission has not gathered momentum, so that an explosive growth in infection numbers could surface later or in a second round. How can we explain this situation in which, so far, India has fared much better than many other parts of the world? Past experience of the Spanish influenza in 1918, when India accounted for 18 to 20 million of the estimated 50 million deaths in the world, or conventional thinking even now, would have led to the opposite conclusion. There are two possible explanations. We can now, Priyanka, return to the stream. I'm sorry I do not have a PowerPoint, so you will have to watch my face through these 40 minutes. First, the reality might be much worse than the statistics suggest in India, because the total number of infections is almost certainly underestimated, as testing has been nowhere near enough given the scarcity of testing kits and the massive size of our population. Improved statistics might change the numbers, but I am convinced cannot transform this asymmetry, which I have highlighted. Second, the lockdown imposed by the government in India, straddling its vast geography, perhaps the most stringent in the world, could have made a difference. The purpose was to break the chain of transmission through social distancing, which in turn has two dimensions. For one, people were confined to their homes. But this created physical distancing only for the privileged, living in homes that had doors and spaces. It was impossible for people in urban slums in megacities, where migrant workers also lived, often as many as 10 to a room. For another, it meant that people could not move between cities and across states, while migrant workers could not return to their villages. This did strangle potential chains of community transmission, even if only in part, reducing the geographical spread of the virus through contagion compared with what it would have been without a lockdown. The obvious explanation, this obvious explanation is necessary but not sufficient, because other countries which have imposed lockdowns, say in Western Europe, with public health systems that are far superior, have not managed to slow down the phenomenal spread in the number of infections as much. The reality that has unfolded so far, not just in India, but across Asia and Africa, compared with North America and Western Europe, is puzzling and deserves some explanation. I am not an epidemiologist, I am not a virologist, but as a social scientist, it is possible to observe outcomes which are counterintuitive and think about plausible hypotheses. The impact of diseases can and does differ across countries and continents, possibly attributable to differences in demographics, geographies, climates, cultures, or immunities. Asia and Africa have much younger populations than Europe and North America, which could explain lower morbidity and mortality. Geographies shape climates, mostly tropical in Asia and Africa, and mostly temperate in the West. It seems that COVID-19 has ravaged Europe and North America, while Asia and Africa, where malaria has been widespread in the past, are relatively unscathed. Anthropologists might reflect on whether or not cultural differences matter. I cannot. Scientists or immunologists could investigate how or why immunities differ. Much of this is largely unexplored so far. It has been suggested that countries which have mandatory BCG vaccinations against tuberculosis are less susceptible to COVID-19 morbidity and mortality. Compare, for example, the Iberian Peninsula countries, Spain and Portugal. On 8th May, Spain had around 260,000 infections and 26,000 deaths, whereas Portugal had 27,000 infections and 1,100 deaths. Is it only a coincidence that BCG vaccinations are mandatory in Portugal, but not in Spain? Or that the United States and Italy, both ravaged by COVID-19, never had universal or mandatory BCG vaccination programs? Obviously, it is only scientific investigation that can establish cause and effect. However, available research by scientists suggests that the BCG vaccine seems to have a stimulating effect on immune systems that goes well beyond TB. There are similar results derived from research on the polio vaccine. The inference drawn is that these vaccines reduce overall mortality more than would be expected through their direct effects on the diseases they are meant to prevent. The conventional assumption is that vaccines create antibodies against specific pathogens. But immunologists have discovered that live vaccines also stimulate what are described as innate immune systems, innate immunities, creating capacities to better resist or to fight other kinds of pathogens too. The notion of immune protection against multiple pathogens is being developed by immunologists. For that reason, perhaps, Some countries are running trials of BCG and polio vaccines against COVID-19 or thinking of it as a means of protecting health workers. Similarly, countries are buying hydroxychloroquine in large quantities from India as a prophylactic for health workers. In India, universal BCG and polio vaccination is mandatory, while immune systems of people have a lifelong exposure to curative and preventive drugs for malaria. Such factors, implicit in demographics, geographies, climates, or immunities, could provide possible explanations for the relatively limited impact of COVID-19 in India, as well as several countries in Asia and Africa so far, when compared with countries in North America and Western Europe. I am sticking my neck out with this hypothesis, which will be tested in the months to come. Let me now turn to the second proposition in my lecture about lives and livelihoods. The draconian nationwide lockdown in India began on 25th March and completed 40 days on 3rd May. It has been extended further until 17th May, with some relaxations in districts that have not had any infection so far or any new infection in the past 21 days. However, these districts account for less than 1/5 of economic activity in the country. And resumption is easier said than done in a situation where there is a complex web of restrictions and supply chains are seriously disrupted. Moreover, the lockdown could continue for longer. There is no downturn yet. And the flattening curve is threatening to rise again with spikes, even if more than 80% of the spread is concentrated in a few cities and just 4 states. For governments everywhere, more so after the experience of Italy, Spain, the United Kingdom, and the United States, where governments did too little too late, imposing and continuing lockdowns is a risk-averse strategy. If the spread can be restrained or managed, the success would bring political dividends. If the spread continues unabated or worsens, the microbe would take the blame for the failure. It is the equivalent of a one-way option in financial markets, tempting political leaders to think that they cannot lose if they opt for lockdowns. It is no surprise that in consultations with Prime Minister Modi, so many chief ministers in India have urged that the lockdown should continue. This is even more attractive now as it conforms to herd behavior by governments everywhere. Exit from a lockdown then poses a real dilemma for governments. It calls for decision-making under high uncertainty, requiring courage that needs both conviction and confidence. This dilemma becomes larger than life when governments emphasize saving lives in a pandemic as the primary, if not their sole objective. Of course, the object of saving lives is in itself unexceptionable, but it must also be recognized that the health of people and the health of an economy are interdependent, where both taken together shape the well-being of people. Thus, saving livelihoods, I would argue, is an equally important objective. In fact, the relationship between lives and livelihoods is circular. If lives are saved, and in so doing, livelihoods are sacrificed, it threatens lives of people who are deprived of their incomes and hence unable to meet their basic human needs. Obviously, this could lead to widespread hunger, reduced immunity, and lost lives. Obviously, getting sick and going hungry cannot be an either-or choice. Everyone would want to stay healthy and be well fed. It is the role of governments, I believe, to strike a balance and reconcile these two objectives rather than juxtapose them as conflicting, requiring a choice to be made. The lockdown has shut down almost 2/3 of the economy, and the collateral damage is enormous. It stranded 25 to 30 million migrants in cities far away from their homes, deprived of their work and dignity, at the mercy of shelters and food provided by state governments or charities, often hungry and homeless. Manufacturing, mining, construction, trade, hotels, restaurants, and transport, which account for more than 40% of both output and employment in India, was shut down completely. Thus, I estimate that as many as 150 million people, about 1/3 of our total workforce, who are casual labor on daily wages or workers in informal employment without any social protection, were deprived of their livelihoods at one stroke. The poor, often self-employed, who constitute 75% and 50% of rural and urban households respectively, have borne a disproportionate share of the burden. The impact on micro, small, and medium enterprises, which account for 1/3 of output and 1/4 of employment in India, has been devastating. Thus, for poor households and small businesses, survival is at risk. Healthcare for patients, except for those with COVID-19, has diminished in terms of both access and quality. In education, learning outcomes, already poor, will get worse as schools and colleges remain closed. In the economy, demand has dropped sharply as employment has contracted, while supply has been strangled by the massive reduction in output. Government revenues for both center and states have collapsed, and even if the lockdown is lifted altogether now, economic growth in 2021 will be at the best zero, but almost certainly negative. The loss of life attributable to the virus must be situated in perspective. In India, on 8 May 2020, the total number of COVID-19 deaths were just about 2,000. In sharp contrast, 450,000 people die from tuberculosis every year. In India, as many as 800,000 infants die every year before reaching the age of 1 year, mostly due to easily preventable causes like pneumonia or diarrhea. Another 1 million children die every year before they attain the age of 5 years. These absolute numbers and child mortality rates are the highest in the world. The economic consequences of the lockdown will make our children even more vulnerable. Lockdowns, combined with mass testing, contact tracing, containment zones, mandatory quarantines, can only slow down the speed at which infections spread. This might help in countries where public health systems are robust, yet not adequate enough for large numbers when infections peak. But our public health system is dilapidated and could never suffice for our large population if the pandemic spreads. There is no vaccine yet. From development through trials to production will be at least 1 year, and far longer before it becomes available in sufficient quantities for our massive population. It is also essential to recognize that the lockdown is not a weapon in a war that can conquer or vanquish the microbe. The virus will be with us for some time to come, at least 1 year, if not longer, and there could be a spike in infections when the lockdown is eased, and such spikes will recur over time and across space. I believe that we have to learn with this, to live with this reality and manage the virus as best as we can. It is now imperative to begin the process of exit from the lockdown. For one, it would enable the government to find some balance between the twin objectives of saving lives and saving livelihoods. For another, it would help restart the economy. which has been almost completely shut down,
Zoom is not
and the
working.
collateral damage is bound to be far greater if
Zoom
the
is not working.
lockdown is extended. Surprisingly enough, a calibrated, planned, and phased exit could also help manage the spread of the virus. So far, morbidity and mortality associated with COVID-19, I have shown in India, is much lower than elsewhere in the world. This is possibly attributable, I would hypothesize, to our immune systems, which have antibodies that could be effective in resisting the virus. After all, millions of migrants stranded in megacities, herded into relief camps, crowded in cramped spaces, the polar opposite of social distancing, have not caught the virus through contagion in large numbers. It suggests that there are already some elements of herd immunity in India that would grow stronger as the lockdown is progressively lifted. This must happen at a much faster pace because the present relaxations are nowhere near enough. It is time to let people get on with their lives. They must return to work and earn to feed their families. Migrants, who are the lifeblood of the urban services economy, should be able to resume work and reclaim their livelihoods. Farmers should no longer be hobbled with restrictions. Construction workers should return to their sites. Shopkeepers should be allowed to sell to their consumers. Micro, small, and medium enterprises, the heart of entrepreneurial India, need to be back in business, and factories need to hum with activity once again. Public transport has to be made functional. Hospitals should be accessible to patients for healthcare, patients other than COVID-19. Schools and colleges need to reopen for learning. Uh, I cannot stress enough, emphasize enough, that the people and the economy cannot simply afford to allow the short-term effects of the past 2 months turning into long-term consequences that could mortgage our future. In an ideal world, lockdowns should be the exception and not the rule, specified in terms of cities, containment zones, and hotspots, or in terms of times to restaurants, shopping malls, cinemas, tourism, congregation in public places, and international travel. Let me now turn to my third proposition about the economy in deep crisis. The economy, already in a downturn before the pandemic surface, is hurt as much as the people, even if the whole is somewhat different from the sum total of the parts. Economic performance has been battered by the contraction of output on the supply side and contraction of employment on the demand side. The consequences will extend much beyond this initial impact, as supply and demand will interact at a macro level. The adverse impact on output and employment will be magnified by multiplier effects. The contraction in employment will multiply through the decline in incomes and purchasing power, reducing output and employment elsewhere in the economy through successive rounds of the same multiplier mechanism. Recovery of production systems and supply chains after the lockdown will take time because economies are not like taps that can be turned off and on. Clearly, whenever the lockdown ends, the economic crisis will run deeper than anything we have experienced so far in independent India, while its intensity will depend upon the duration of the lockdown. Stabilization will be the immediate task of the government. The meaning of stabilization in economics, let me say, is much the same as in medicine. Just as medical treatment seeks to stabilize the health of a patient in critical condition, economic management needs to stabilize an economy in deep crisis. The short-term focus would have to be on households on the demand side and on firms on the supply side. Survival through the crisis is essential for the return of poor households and small businesses to economic activities. The poor, identified as 50% and 75% of urban and rural households respectively, should be provided, we have argued, with cash support of rupees 6,000 per month for 3 months, which is the equivalent of the MNREGA wage at 200 rupees per day. For 15 million households, this will cost 2.7 trillion rupees. In addition, the supplementary free ration of 5 kg wheat or rice and 1 kg of pulses per month for 3 months, which the government has announced in a more stingy manner, should be tripled. Government stocks of wheat and rice exceed stocking norms on 1st April by 55 million tons. The supplementary free rations can be easily tripled to 45 kg of wheat or rice and 9 kg of pulses for a 3-month period, using Aadhaar cards, as Jean Dresse has argued, where the poor do not have ration cards. Micro, small, and medium enterprises, which are the backbone of the economy, provide 1/4 of employment and more than 2/3 of export earnings in India, are overwhelmed by problems. Payment of wages to workers is virtually impossible. Fixed costs on electricity, rent, and interest have to be met. There are inventories of inputs that cannot be used and of outputs that cannot be sold. Working capital is exhausted. Reviving production, whenever allowed, will be much easier said than done. MSMEs anxiously await a relief package from government, much talked about, that remains a distant promise. The only morsel they have at the moment is a moratorium of 90 days on servicing debt. It is essential to provide liquidity support and bankruptcy protection to MSMEs through Reserve Bank of India lines of credit to banks, I would say at least rupees 1 trillion, with a backstop by the government, also using mudra to provide support where possible. Such support at the micro level for survival would have to be combined with support at the macro level through fiscal and monetary policies for recovery. It is essential for the government to set aside its conservatism, bordering on a fetishism, and provide a fiscal stimulus that is in the range of rupees 10 trillion, about 5% of GDP. In addition to the existing fiscal deficit, that would be at least another 5% of GDP. The enlarged fiscal deficit cannot be financed by market borrowing. It would simply drive up interest rates and nip recovery in the bud. It would have to be financed by monetizing the deficit. In other words, the Reserve Bank of India would have to buy government treasury bills, essentially printing money, which is now described as helicopter money. Monetary policy would need to bring down interest rates by 1 to 2 percentage points, plus quantitative easing through RBI lines of credit to banks to assist large firms, particularly in distressed sectors such as construction, automobiles, airlines, tourism, and hospitality, inter alia by restructuring their debt. Orthodox thinking, so deeply, which is obsessive about fiscal deficits, so deeply embedded in the government, suggests to me the absence of even the most rudimentary understanding of macroeconomics. It also reveals an utter failure to recognize that we live in extraordinary, unprecedented times, with the world economy in a crisis that could run much deeper than the Great Depression 90 years ago. The idea that monetized deficits would lead to inflation when deflation stares us in the face is blind to the reality of stagnation in an economy. The worry about a downgrade from credit rating agencies, which have witnessed a steady erosion of their ethics and integrity everywhere, I think is just bizarre. Those who worry about the consequences of such expansionary macroeconomic policies should provide their alternative for recovery, while the government should worry about the consequences of not doing what I am suggesting. If the economy is in a free fall, the massive slippage in government revenues, believe me, would balloon the fiscal deficit to similar, if not higher levels without any hope of recovery. The belief of orthodox economists in the strong spring analogy, the harder you push an economy down, the greater the force with which it bounces back, is an illusion. In reality, a weak spring is the more appropriate analogy for an economy, for when it is pushed too hard, poor households, small businesses, it may simply remain there if its restorative forces are destroyed. Beyond survival, stabilization, and recovery, there are also opportunities in this crisis which need to be captured by the government. But there is a clear and present danger that these opportunities might be missed by the conservative, possibly timid mindsets which do not seem capable of thinking big and thinking long. Let me just give you a few examples. The collapse in the prices of crude oil and petroleum products, in particular, and the prices of primary commodities in general, will be of enormous help to India in the process of economic recovery, as it is a major importer, not only by easing balance of payments problems, but also by reducing input costs across the board in manufacturing for both final and intermediate goods. Of course, this boon must not be neutralized by a cash-strapped government seeking to capture windfall gains by hiking taxes, as it has done in petroleum products. Similarly, a depreciation of the rupee that might follow from adverse expectations about the economy, I would bless credit ratings for rating agencies for downgrades, or portfolio investment flows would be a blessing in disguise. For one, it would dampen footloose and volatile capital inflows. For another, it would boost exports that have stagnated for years, at least 6 years, burdened by an overvalued exchange rate, and do so without pushing up the import bill or prices, since oil and commodity prices are at such a low. Once again, this opportunity should not be squandered by misguided attempts to support the rupee instead of just letting it depreciate. There are other opportunities which, if captured now, could, I think, bring enormous dividends in the medium term. The deindustrialization that India has witnessed over the past quarter century, because of a unilateral trade liberalization and a complete abandoning of industrial policy, could be reversed. The rhetoric of Make in India could be turned into reality. If only we could begin manufacturing for world markets as large international firms, particularly from Japan and the Republic of Korea, or even the United States, relocate production out of China. But this would require the government to formulate strategic industrial policy that coordinates trade, technology, fiscal, monetary, and exchange rate policies for reviving industrialization. It would also require, I believe, massive investments in physical infrastructure, particularly power, roads, transport, and ports. This should be done without moaning and groaning about financing, for it would serve two purposes. As government expenditure on infrastructure creates employment and stimulates demand to revive economic growth in the short run, and remove supply constraints that would stimulate the economy through strong multiplier effects in the long run. Last but not least, this is a wake-up call to improve our social infrastructure on public health, which would save lives lost through easily preventable causes that I outlined, child mortality, for example, to bring about significant improvements on the well-being of people. It is time for me to conclude with just a few brief reflections on the way forward, which recapitulate from what I have argued. One, the virus will be there for some time yet. We have to learn to live with it and manage it as best as we can. The next Monday, 18th May, I believe, must be the beginning of the end of the national lockdown. But phasing cannot be too slow or too partial. It must be significant. In an ideal world, as I said, lockdown should be the exception and not the rule, specified in terms of geographical space to cities, containment zones, and hotspots, and in terms of specified time horizons for restaurants, shopping malls, cinemas, tourism, congregations in public places, or international travel. Two, while the government has done what the government has done for the poor and the migrants is too little, too late. It's almost pathetic as a response to the acute humanitarian crisis. There is need to provide free rations of wheat or rice and pulses to poor households, rural and urban, for a 3-month period, which can be done simply by using excess stocks of food grains, which would rot in our warehouses, based on Aadhaar cards where the poor do not have ration cards. It is also essential to provide cash transfers, rupees 6,000 per month for 3 months, as the ISLE has argued, for at least 150 million households. 3, micro, small, and medium enterprises, which employ 110 million people and contribute 1/3 of national income, need a relief package that would help them to survive their existential crisis. Promises apart, the government has done nothing, absolutely nothing for small businesses so far. In the absence of support, there will be no comebacks for a significant proportion of MSMEs. That will be a crippling blow to the economy. 4, the government must put in place a stabilization program for the economy to coincide with the lifting of the lockdown. There is no time for the finance minister to keep thinking. It cannot wait for prolonged deliberations. The fiscal stimulus in 2021 to address the crisis would have to be an extra 5% of GDP, in addition to the union budget estimate of 3.5%, which will turn out to be much larger, at least 5%, if not more. This will have to be financed by the Reserve Bank of India, monetizing the deficit. Monetary policy would need to drop interest rates by 100 to 200 basis points, together with quantitative easing through RBI, which would provide large, ample lines of liquidity to the financial sector, as has been done in the United States, in Britain, in Germany, in the Republic of Korea, in China, and in Japan. That would help them resume production and restructure their debt. Distressed sectors will need special support. 5, and this is something I am remiss, but I am conscious of time, I did not discuss. I would be happy to return to it in Q&A. State government finances, which are a mess because of massive revenue shortfalls, will have to be rescued by relaxing the overdraft facilities and the strict limit on market borrowing specified under Fiscal Responsibility and Budget Management Act. Please remember, it is state governments that are at the front line of this battle. 6, the government needs to be proactive in thinking about and capturing the opportunities that have been created by the crisis. Incredibly low prices of oil and primary commodities, or, I hope, a depreciating rupee, to help recovery in the short run. It must also focus on strategic coordination of economic policies to reindustrialize it in India, to make in India a reality as the world economy seeks to reduce its excessive dependence on China. Massive investments in infrastructure, power, road, transports, and ports would revive demand in the short run and medium term and stimulate supply in the long term to revive and sustain economic growth. The challenge in the sphere of public health should be seen as an opportunity to save lives and improve the well-being of people. Thank you all for listening. I've kept to my limit of 45 minutes. I am open to questions from those who are listening.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Naya, very much for keeping in time and also delivering a very lucid lecture. You not only analyze the current situation, but also uh, given a pathway which can be helpful in revising both economy and also saving livelihoods. So thank you very much. We have received a lot of questions from
I'm not
various
surprised.
from various parts of the country, as well as a few from abroad also. Uh, I won't venture uh, into categorizing the various questions. I can't do it because there will be maybe 30, 40 questions. But let me uh, uh, put the questions to you in 3, 4 rounds.
Okay, thank you. Yes,
Yeah.
easier for me to
Uh,
respond. Yeah.
One question is, or opinion is about fiscal policy and monetary policy.
Yep.
Also, taxation. Uh, Several people have asked whether one should rely on indirect taxes when the state revenues have dwindled. GST is falling because there is hardly any demand in the economy. So, what should be done? Uh, Dr. Sumit Majumdar from UK, he has asked you whether there should be wealth tax, whether should be super rich tax, or
Sorry, whether there should be a.
super rich tax or
Okay.
wealth tax instead of relying on indirect taxes. Many other people have also asked you about your views on uh, mm, uh, increase in the liquor taxes. Uh, of course, several people have also criticized it because state governments are relying on, and which is central government is also encouraging them, in their view, to uh, levy more and more taxes on liquor. Whether this is a sustainable way of increasing revenue by the state. So this is one set of questions. Uh, uh, One questioner has also asked you, why don't you defend government? Because government, the question was lives versus livelihood in the beginning. Now, uh, uh, government is also addressing livelihood issues. So one should not be blind to the steps taken by the government. This is another. Uh, uh, so these questions you can address. Then there are a number of questions on migrants about which I will come.
Sure. Thank you, Alak. Let me say that if we are thinking about revenues of the government, they will accrue with time lags, whatever we do. Yeah? So that if you think of a reform of direct taxes, given what compliance is like, given that it will come into force a year later for income that accrues in this year, taxes payable in the next year, will take time. While many of these things are necessary and desirable, I certainly think that a wealth tax or an inheritance tax is something we should think about for the medium term. In the short run, now, there is absolutely no time to think of increasing government incomes or curbing government expenditures in the short run. Government revenues are going to experience massive shortfalls in this financial year and possibly in the next, just as government expenditures are going to pound. But this does not mean that fiscal policy and monetary policy cease to be powerful, potent instruments in the management of the economy. I believe that at this juncture, fiscal policy is much more about increasing expenditures than it is about increasing revenues. The latter can happen only with a very significant time lag. The question then is, how do we meet the difference between income and expenditure? And that, as I said, has to come in this extraordinary situation from monetizing the deficit, borrowing from the Reserve Bank of India, using helicopter money to stimulate demand, revive the economy so that you begin to get some supply responses. Similarly, I am convinced that monetary policy is a very powerful instrument. Although in a situation such as this, even if we drop interest rates by 1 to 2 percentage points, it is the willingness and ability of the commercial banking system to lend to firms that is in doubt. And therefore, monetary policy is no longer simply about the price of credit, interest rates. Monetary policy is much more about the availability and disbursement of credit, which we might call quantitative easing in a different context. And that can come in a situation where the commercial banks, overloaded with non-performing assets, are so risk averse that can come if and only if the central bank, the Reserve Bank of India, extends lines of liquidity with RBI backstop and government backstop, so that the financial sector begins the lending process. Okay. Now, there is one thing that I had intended to talk about, but did not, because I did not want to exceed the time, because I think Q&A is important. We need to recognize that state government finances are in an incredible mess because of the national lockdown. If we look at the composition of state government revenue receipts, or if we look at the composition of the receipts of state governments, on average, 52% come from the state's own tax revenues, and 48% come on average from central transfers, which in turn have two components: the statutory transfer that comes from the sharing of tax revenues with the central government, and the discretionary transfers to state governments. And that is 26 and 22% respectively, making up the 48%. Now, if we look at the state's own tax revenues, revenue receipts, something like 42–45% come from state GST, okay? And 25% comes from petroleum products, 15% from liquor sales, and the remaining 10–12% from registration of vehicles and tax and stamp duty on property transactions. Now, just think of it. As you know, as far as central transfers are concerned, there is going to be a massive revenue shortfall in tax revenues that accrue to the central government, and 42% of that, which is meant to accrue to state governments, will be so much less in absolute terms. And the discretionary non-statutory transfers will also diminish because the central government finances are in a crunch. Now, for the state governments, there's a double whammy. More than 2/5 of their tax revenues come from state GST, okay, which is essentially on non-essential goods. Now, no non-essential goods have been produced or sold in states since the 25th of March. Those revenues are zero, combined with a much smaller absolute amount that will accrue from GST, the state share of GST in central revenues. Petroleum products, the demand has come down by half. So tax revenues pro rata have come down by half from petroleum. Liquor, there have been no liquor sales. So 15% of revenues have been missing. There has been no registration of vehicles. There's been no registration of property transactions. Now, just think if you are the finance minister of a state, Thomas Isaac in Kerala, Sushil Modi in Bihar. What would you do? You do not even have money to pay salaries in the next month to state government employees, let alone provide the kind of support poor households, migrant workers, small businesses need in states, which is where they are located. Now, sadly, state governments, given our fiscal system, federal though it is in theory, have no space. Both the central government and the state government have overdraft facilities at the RBI. For the central government, in the current financial year, this overdraft facility is about 125,000 crores. For all state governments put together, this overdraft facility is 30,000 crores, right? Now, the RBI, in its generosity, has said that you can exceed this overdraft limit by 30%, and now another 30%. But compared with the state government's needs, this is peanuts. Now, if there is a difference between the income and the expenditure of state governments, it can then, given that overdraft facilities are so negligible, it can be met only through market borrowing. But the Fiscal Responsibility and Budget Management Act imposes a ceiling of 3% of the gross state domestic product as the market borrowing you can do. Now, I think it is essential, absolutely essential, for this to be relaxed during 2021 and 21-22, so that state governments can borrow not just 3% of their GSDP, but as much as 4 to 4.5% of their GSDP. That is essential for the survival of people, firms, and state economies. Okay. Now, I don't want to say, I'm not here to defend the government. The government is perfectly capable of defending itself. It's nice to see that they are beginning to recognize that it's not only about lives, but it's also about livelihoods. So I feel that I have been vindicated in that sense. But what worries me about the government, and that's why I find it indefensible, that there is no clear thinking. Today is the 11th of March. We do not know. People do not know what will happen on the 18th of March. Is there, if we are going to begin to get out of the lockdown, how is it going to proceed? Remember that in any economy, actors or agents need to be informed so that they can make decisions. But I will go no further on this question. Let us go to the next round, Alak.
You have already dealt with state finance, and several questions have been raised about it. Dr. Lakhvinder Singh asked whether the 5% expenditure by central government, which you are proposing on as a percentage of GDP, will be able to also provide resources to the state government, because they are in the dire need of finances. So similar other questions have been asked about state governments. Dr. Ghumman asked about MSME particularly. You have already indicated in your lecture some questions about MSE, but he is concerned about it. Dr. Rizwanul Islam, he has two questions. One is, how easy will it be to manage localized hotspot-based lockdown rather than general lockdown? This is one question. The other question he asked, he would have loved to hear a little bit more about the long-run issues of reducing vulnerability and building resilience to meet such crises in future. As it is, the poor and vulnerable who are most affected by any crisis, their capacity to face them should be strengthened. In view, this is should be the a very important policy, but how it can be fit.
Okay, let me take this round. Um, in response to Lakhwinder Gill, let me say that when I am suggesting that stabilization and recovery of the economy requires an extra fiscal deficit that is 5% of GDP. If you like, you can call that the COVID-19 or the pandemic fiscal deficit. That in itself will not help state governments, except insofar as it increases the ability of the central government to provide non-statutory discretionary transfers to state governments, all right? Which are about, as I said, 22% of total state government revenues or incomes. It will help. But insofar as the share of state governments in central government revenues is concerned, it will depend entirely on the revenues that accrue. Now, you know, it is a chicken and the egg story here. So that if what I am suggesting helps stabilization of the economy in the short run and recovery much sooner than would have happened without such intervention, revenue shortfalls will not be as acute as they would have been otherwise. And after a time, revenues might stabilize. That will indirectly help state governments. In the short run, however, if we are thinking of the current financial year, I think that enlarged fiscal deficit would only help the state governments if the central government uses a part of this to increase discretionary transfers to states, which is a little more than 1/5 their income on average in a year. But it will not happen with the state's shares of revenues. So that the double whammy on GST for state governments will continue. I think the only way to provide degrees of freedom to state governments in these very difficult times is A, to double their overdraft facility. But that, remember, is only a ways and means advance. It is to get rid of the mismatch between income and expenditure flows. But nevertheless, if the overdraft facility is doubled, they will not have a sort of cash management day-to-day crisis. But that is really a relatively small proportion of the problem. I think that the FRBM limit on market borrowing must be raised from 3% of gross state domestic product to 4.5% of gross state domestic product. Now, this does not mean that every state will borrow as much, because remember, as states enter the domestic capital market, interest rates on their paper are going up. So the costs are rising. But it is an enabling provision. So I think that would be the best way forward for state governments. And, you know, even God helps those who help themselves. State governments do have freedoms in terms of their own revenues. They can impose cesses. They can create incomes in the short run to help revive the economy, which in turn will revive the state's own tax revenues. That is what they have to work towards. Okay. The questions that I think Professor Ghumman asked about MSMEs, I spoke about it briefly, and I can elaborate on it. But my simple point is that small businesses will die unless there is a lifeline provided in terms of liquidity, which will meet their costs during the lockdown, fixed costs. Most people can't pay wages, but they have to pay rents, they have to pay interest, they have to pay electricity bills, and it will keep them away from bankruptcy. Now, I think that the RBI needs to provide a line of liquidity to, say, the SIDBI, to commercial banks, to non-bank financial institutions, in terms of a dedicated line for MSMEs. That line of credit is available and can be used only to support MSMEs. I think that is probably the best thing we can do in the short run. Let me return to turn now to Rizwan's question. I actually think, Rizwan, that lockdowns will be far easier to manage if they are confined to hotspots, to containment zones, to demarcated areas within megacities. And indeed, if you hear what the Chief Minister of Delhi says, what the Chief Minister of Maharashtra says, if you live in a megacity, or the Chief Minister of Telangana says, or Tamil Nadu, if you live in a megacity which has COVID-19 infections, you call the entire megacity a red spot, you shut down everything there. And I think that it will be far easier for state governments and for local district administrations to manage effective lockdowns if they're confined to hotspots and containment zones, rather than becoming mega citywide. Okay, so I think that is more feasible, and I think much more desirable. That's the direction in which we should move. Because if you lock down all of Mumbai, or all of Bangalore, or all of Hyderabad, or all of Chennai, then the supply chains, the upstream, downstream activities won't help resumption of production. So I would say lockdowns should be localized. And I actually did say that even in my lecture, that they should be defined in terms of space. Reducing vulnerability in the long run. There are many ideas that just as we have a rural employment guarantee scheme, we should have a urban employment guarantee scheme that provides social protection to migrant workers. But I think in the ultimate analysis, all of these are transfer payments. And they are difficult to sustain in any economy where there are fiscal constraints. So while we should provide a form of social protection, okay, and that could be in the form of a employment guarantee scheme that's not only rural but also urban, we need to think of economic policies that create employment, that help stimulate employment. And we have discovered in India that while the possibilities of creating employment in agriculture are negligible, and the possibilities of creating employment in rural industrialization so far have been limited, but it is possible to think of a model of rural industrialization where, town and village enterprises would play a role in this process, meeting domestic demand. But we can reduce vulnerability in the long term by providing a minimal social protection, but this must be supported by an attempt to formulate policies that are supportive of employment creation. That is the only way we will be able to reduce vulnerability in the long term. And may I say, I am not a fan of economic growth. It is necessary but not sufficient. But if we can revive economic growth, however unequal the income distribution, it will make the vulnerability of the poor less than it would be in the absence of that growth. So I think working towards reviving economic growth at the same time as providing minimal social protection for the poor and attempting endeavoring to be employment friendly will make a difference. I do think that at this juncture, it is important to think of migrant workers. I don't know whether Professor Srivastav is here and listening. He has done some fascinating work on how large the problem is, how we can help. But we do need clearly some minimal protection of the rights of migrant workers. We talk about the rights of our migrant workers in the oil exporting countries in the Middle East, but we don't talk about the right of our migrant workers from Bihar, UP, Orissa, West Bengal, in other parts of India. Some state governments are more sensitive, some state governments are insensitive. But should there not be, there exists a legislation, should there not be a registration of all migrant workers in the state? Should it not be ensured that migrant workers receive exactly the same benefits as local workers, whatever Shiv Sena might say in Mumbai? So we need to pay serious attention to this issue.
Yeah, Professor Nair, in fact, several questions have been asked on migrant labor.
Yeah.
There are two kinds of views. One set of people like Dr. Manasi Mitra and some other people, they have asked you what kind of environment should be created in rural areas so that migrant labor return and also they participate in rural development, means regeneration of rural demand. The other set of questions is that whatever we may do, in rural areas there can't be much opportunities where rural labor can, migrants can sustain themselves. So what kind of conducive environment should be created in urban areas and in the industry so that they are settled? Persons like Dr. Pushpendra Kumar have asked you whether the government should have allowed migrant between 24th and 28th March itself, when the lockdown was announced, and there should have been policy to send them to the rural areas at that time, instead of now that they are being sent. So on migration, there are several questions. The other set of questions, and again, I can see 5-6 questions, are on labor laws. Several people have
on labor laws. Okay.
Labor laws. Several people have expressed concern on the erosion of labor legislations in various states in last 2-3 days. UP, UP, MP, many states have done this. So they have asked your opinion, what should be done? Dr. Dinesh Awasthi thinks that he has asked you, could you please reflect on liberalizing labor laws like 12 hours working hours? Most SMEs have not been able to pay to their workers. What could be done? What will be impact on new labor legislations once the industry opens? So these are two sets of questions. The third set of questions is about Mahatma Gandhi National National Employment Guarantee Program, whether that will only be able to attract people. What other things, other activities should be done in rural areas apart from NREGS so that the rural economy is revived? So these are three sets of other questions.
All right. I see that I have about 10 minutes to go before we get to 7:30. So I will try and answer the questions, but do so briefly. First, what are the possibilities and what degrees of freedom do we have for creating non-agricultural employment in rural India. It is clear as daylight that the employment elasticity of output in agriculture is zero or negative, and agriculture will not create employment. It will almost certainly displace workers. Now, the real constraint on creating livelihoods in rural India is twofold. First, that we have not developed rural industrialization. And I always think of Trilok Papola, our old friend at ISLE. We have not done anything systematic to promote rural industrialization. So there is no non-agricultural employment in labor-intensive manufacturing yet. It is possible for state governments, and for state governments alone, to try and provide a supportive physical infrastructure, investment financing, and land for manufacturing activities to promote rural industry. But while that could be a complement, it can never be a substitute for migration of workers from rural to urban India. Please remember that the contribution of the agricultural sector to GDP is at most 15%, while its share directly and indirectly in employment is 45%. Now, what does that mean? It means that GDP per capita in rural India is about 1/10 of GDP per capita in urban India. So there is a huge push factor. And there's a push factor because there's no employment in the poorer states in rural areas. And there's a pull factor because even if the probability of getting employment through the migrant social network is not 100%, whatever you earn will be 3 times, 4 times, 5 times, maybe even 10 times what you earn in a village. And remember that, in fact, here we are thinking of private income. But if you think of social consumption, if you think of infrastructure that exists in mega cities compared with villages, the living standards of the migrant workers, however low they are much higher than they are often in villages. So we are not going to be able to turn that tide that people will stop migrating from villages to cities and will find their ideal home in rural India. We can try and create an environment which creates employment through non-agricultural activities, not just industries, but other forms of services, but there are limits to that process, okay? So I think the second question is actually much more important. What can we do for migrant workers in cities? You know, I think this pandemic and lockdown have made us recognize how dependent India's megacities and how dependent urban India is on migrant workers who are the backbone of the urban service economy, whether it's courier services, delivery services, transport services, restaurant services, you name it, in construction services, everywhere. What we therefore need to do is, as a first step, use the existing legislation more effectively, amend the legislation on migrant workers in cities so that migrant workers are registered in every state, so that they have an entitlement to forms of social protection that local citizens have, and that their rights as workers in the in informal employment are somehow better protected. But that is impossible to implement legally as labor scarcity surface. And we have seen this happen in other Asian countries. Employers themselves in the small businesses become much more worker friendly because they want to retain them, particularly if they have acquired skills in the time that they have worked for them. So there are a number of things that we can and should do for migrant workers from rural India in our mega cities. That is the future. Every society in history has urbanized, slowly but surely, and so will we. And therefore, while we should do everything to create more livelihoods in rural India, we cannot take away either the push or the pull of people who come from villages to cities in India to work and improve their livelihoods and their well-being. So we must do what we can to protect their rights as migrant workers and give them the minimum social protection that's available to non-migrant citizens of a state. I'm not going to say much about labor laws. There is one view in orthodox economics which says we need much more labor flexibility. Now, if you look at the periodic labor force survey for 2017-18, you see the evidence is stunning. 90% of people are self-employed, casual labor on daily wages, or informal workers without any social protection. And even in the formal sector, there are many workers who work without social protection. Okay, so thinking of labor market flexibility of the kind that the industry, that orthodox economics, that some finance ministers want, makes no sense to me. We do have very flexible labor markets. But what can we do to protect the rights of workers who have almost no bargaining power? Now, the trade union movement has been decimated. And in any case, it was always a kind of labor aristocracy that bargained for wages in the organized sector. But there are no collectives, there are no trade unions, there is no collective bargaining in the informal services sector or decentralized SMEs manufacturing sector. The only thing we can and have to do is to make more effective the existing laws that we have on protecting workers. Some progress has been made. If you look at, say, security personnel, private security personnel, who are maybe about 10% of the migrants in urban India, most of their contractors now have to provide some contribution to the Employees Provident Fund, to ESIC. That is beginning to happen. I think that will strengthen over time once we begin to strengthen the rights of migrants, give them legal rights, make them residents of a state, register them, recognize them. It will help. Now, what state governments are doing. I read about what the Chief Minister of Uttar Pradesh has done, or what Chief Minister Vasundhara Raje did when she was in Rajasthan. They have sort of diluted workers' rights that exist on paper, but do not exist in practice, in an attempt to woo investment either from large domestic firms or from large international firms. We know from both theory and history that this is a race to the bottom. Okay, tax holidays are much more effective than promising a strike-free world. If you look at Himachal Pradesh, it's tiny. Look at its share of total production of pharmaceuticals in India. Why? Because it has provided fiscal concessions. So I think state governments would do much better in attracting scarce investable resources from elsewhere in India or from abroad if they use tax policy, tax concessions, tax holidays more effectively, rather than promising repressive labor policies that ruled out strikes. In any case, there are now very, very few strikes in India because collective bargaining, unions, shop floors have so diminished. So let me with that stop, Alak. We are almost at 7:30 and we should finish. I'm sorry I was not able to answer all the questions, but this is the best we could do in the time we had available.
There are some more questions, but I'm not going to put before you because, as you said, it is 7:30. I apologize to those people whose questions I have not been able to put before you, or because of lack of time, we have not been able to address them. But thank you very much, Professor Nayar, and all the participants in this webinar. It has been really fascinating. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Yes, before we formally close this session, I would just like to say thank you, Professor Nair, for this very, very, very engaging lecture. And Professor Sharma also for moderating it so well. I am sure he has picked up most of the, it was nice that he grouped it in 3 different segments. However, I see that close to 200 questions, people engaged with us through 200 questions. On YouTube, there were 50 to 60 people engaging with us. I'm going to create a compendium of all these questions, and I'm definitely going to share it with Professor Nair. And I'm sure, all this will definitely add to the present discourse on COVID-19 and its impact on work, employment, and livelihoods, and the economy. Thank you very much, Professor Nair and Professor Sharma. Also, I would just like to take a couple of names who have helped us to bring this whole, webinar together. Aditi Madan, who's our communication, who's handling our communication for this, for the social media and everything. So thank you, Aditi. And on the back end, we have Wahid and we have Fatima from our Concept Solutions who have helped us navigate Zoom and the live YouTube streaming. Thanks to them as well. And also to our own office, Jyoti, Shri Prakash ji, and everyone. And of course, Amar for bringing all this act together. So thank you very much. I see there are, 500 people who engaged with us. And there are so many on YouTube as well. This lecture will also be available on our YouTube link. Please visit IHD India. And also, we will put up all the updates on our website and our Facebook and our other social media handles. So thank you very much. Thank you, Professor Sharma. Thank you, Professor Nair. And thank you to all the participants.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.